Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another Blackbox, and this will be a serious one. First off, though, there's no mic plugged in right now because I'm afraid my trusty old mic has started to give up the ghost. Seems like there might be a fray in the cord, so apologies for that. For the rest of the video, it will be plugged in. I'm just re-recording the intro because it was the worst, but it will cut out a time or two. I do apologize. I don't think it disrupts the video too much, and I will have to go on Amazon and order another one. I use the wireless sometimes, but for these videos I like using the wired. But yeah, I want to give that kind of disclosure. And this is a serious Blackbox because it's 15 months since the war in Ukraine, and yes, it is a war started. It's not a special military event or action or pageant. That doesn't work. America tried that kind of bullshit in Vietnam. And it's a controversial thing online, and folks, it really shouldn't be. And that's the point of this video. I'm going to go through the reasons that it was started, both what was said and real, and then talk about the outcome, and at the end give some real world, real life examples of what this is doing to not only Ukrainians but Russians too. So stay to that point. I just asked everyone to be polite and listen to the end, because really this isn't a matter of U.S. politics. This isn't a matter of this or that. This is one of those times in history when I do sincerely feel there's a right and a wrong. And even if you're not on the human level, just on economics and military, this whole thing has been an unmitigated disaster for not only Russia, but Putin himself, believe it or not. So that's what I'm going to outline in this video. Keep in mind that these black boxes aren't scripted. I don't take notes, so you're not going to get citations. This isn't my day job. This is the channel I come to blow off steam. I have 2 other jobs for that. So this is just going off kind of my memory and recollection. So I probably will get things wrong, and I probably have not even come close to having read everything you have or seen all the sources online. Yada yada yada. There's way too much information on the modern internet to really do that. I've done what I can, and I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure most know, but just for those who don't, I did study Russia, Slavic, Cold War type history in university. Did my master's, and I started visiting Russia in 2004. Culminating towards the end of 2008, where I actually lived there. I've also visited Ukraine, although never lived there. So that's my background for what it is. There are many who know more than me, but I'm not a complete novice, and I am speaking about places I've at least been to. Take that for what you will. And again, this is my opinion, but on some of this stuff I do feel pretty strongly about, and I ask that you just kind of take the American politics kind of out of it, because they're not really relevant for this. This is a Russia. This is a Ukraine thing. This is a Soviet Union, at least the ghost of it. And there's no one who wins. Everyone loses with this. Well, almost everyone. There is one party that maybe is going to come out of this better than the others, but no one else really does. So, we're going to hop into it. Like I said, this past bit I recorded, the mic is starting to give out. I'll have to hop on Amazon and get a new one, so apologies again for the cutouts, but I don't think they cut out anything too vital. But if I'm wrong, I apologize in advance. So all I ask is you listen and feel free to give your own take in the comments. Feel free to disagree, but please do be respectful, because this is truly a serious issue. Not respectful of me, but respectful of the Russians and the Ukrainians whose lives have been dramatically impacted by, frankly, the hubris of a dictator. So, with that, let's get into it. You know, when America went into Iraq in March of 2003, and the reason kind of changed from WMDs to bringing freedom to all that stuff, and we all groaned inside. Well, that's going on here, but even more so. Russia's reason for starting the war in February of 2022. There's the truth, but first, what are the excuses? Well, there were a few. There was the one about Russian nationals, ethnic Russians, experiencing genocide in the Donbass region. Not true. Might they have experienced some discrimination? Possibly. We're talking at workplace stuff. I didn't really come across much, but it's possible. But was there actual genocide, like camps and murder? No evidence has come up. And honestly, if you think you've got some, I strongly encourage you to examine your source. The second reason, there were Nazis in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian government. This had a modicum of truth with the Azov battalion, but really this only gained steam after the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. And as has been pointed out time and time again, and as I know you know, Zelensky is a Jew. Were there some Nazis in Ukraine? Yeah. Are there some Nazis in Russia itself? Also, yes. Are there some in England? Yes. Are there some in America? Well, not as many as you might think, because calling someone a Nazi has been a political tactic here for so long. Basically, it just is code for, I don't like that person, or they're politically opposed to me. But in reality, there are a few true skinheads in America that legitimately say we are Nazis or neo-Nazis. So every country has some. If we were saying that was a legitimate reason for invading them, everyone could invade everyone. Mexico and Canada can invade us. France can invade the UK, and then the UK can invade France, because they've all got Nazis. The point was they weren't in control of the government. And you heard Putin said that Ukraine was seeking to develop nuclear weapons, and or NATO was seeking to establish nuclear weapons in Ukraine. This is when NATO gets really brought into it. No evidence of that. In fact, and we'll talk more about the history, Ukraine voluntarily gave up their nuclear weapons way back in the 90s with assurances from Russia that they would safeguard them, protect them, and with the US and the UK kind of being secondary signatories to this agreement to get nuclear weapons, prevent nuclear proliferation around the world. Seemed like a good idea in the 90s. It really did. No evidence. Kind of related to that, chemical weapons. There were accusations of labs in Ukraine producing weapons. They even claimed that there were some that were specifically targeting Russians, but not Ukrainians, which would be an amazing feat of biological engineering, considering that Russians and Ukrainians are biologically, genetically, ethnically the same people. Again, no evidence. And if you think you have some, I strongly encourage you to examine your sources, because it's been well over a year and nothing has been brought to light. And if they'd found some, it would be everywhere. NATO's Eastern expansion. Oh boy. How to unpack this. And what's funny is, this doesn't really directly impact Ukraine. But let's go back to the end of the Cold War. 1989, of course, the Berlin Wall falls, and it's clear that East and West Germany will soon unify. At that time, during talks, Mikhail Gorbachev said at one point that NATO, i.e. America really, had guaranteed that they wouldn't go eastward, no eastward expansion. The thing is, he later walked this claim back, saying it was never explicitly said or even really talked about. Keep in mind, this is Bush administration, extension of Reagan. It's back and forth. He said, she's some diplomat informally say, yeah, we're not interested. Yeah, maybe, possibly. But there was nothing signed. There was no signed treaty to this effect. So when Germany reunified in 1991, of course it was going to be NATO. Let's just be realistic. West Germany had been a member of NATO since the 50s. It would have been totally impossible to have West Germany, NATO, East Germany, not NATO, when they were the same damn country. And thinking that NATO would give up Germany, pretty much the economic powerhouse in Europe, at least after recovery, no one thought that. Gorbachev was not stupid. He knew that. And as early as 1993, you didn't have NATO so much courting former comm bloc nations to join as you had nations like Poland wanting to join NATO. Gee, I wonder why. Because the Soviets had been so kind to them since 1939. Is it any wonder that Poland was one of the very first to sign up for NATO? Because NATO is a mutual defense organization. Funnily enough, only European nations can really join, with the exception of, North America. And their authority is actually strictly curtailed in the Northern Hemisphere, and even with the latitude and longitude is restricted. So, for example, NATO doesn't really have authority in the Pacific area. But I digress. So this is around the time that Ukraine voluntarily agrees to give up its nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of back and forth now with Yeltsin in charge in Russia. And he does make it clear that, they don't want NATO expanding, which is perfectly logical from the Russian perspective. In 97, this happens. And in 99, Russia objects, right or wrong, it doesn't matter, to NATO intervention, peacekeeping in the former Yugoslavia, Serbia and that area. You can go back and forth on that. It's also in this year NATO receives new members. But at the same time, Russia set up between Russia and NATO. And then Russia agreed to the NATO Foundation Act or Accord, which will or policy, meaning that any European nation that want to join could join. They could submit applications, they meet the criteria, they can join in. Now keep in mind, to join NATO, not only does the nation have to vote on it, either public referendum or their legislative body, but also every member of NATO essentially has veto power for other new members joining, which is actually key to what happened in 2000. Right as President Bill Clinton was going out, a new president-elect was coming in Russia, who was essentially Yeltsin's handpicked successor, Vladimir Putin. And this is when Putin famously floated the idea, I don't want to say asked, that's not correct, but floated the idea of joining NATO. Now, I do want to back up. I mentioned Clinton, and it's true that in 96, Clinton publicly espoused and encouraged Eastern European nations to join NATO. But actually going back to 94, during midterm elections, which went well for the Republicans, not so well for the Democrats, One of the things that Republicans were very in favor of at that time was expanding NATO, at least opening the door for former communist nations to join. That was something considered pro-Republican. And many, many nations were interested. Back to 2000 and Putin, what he did was kind of one of those offers. You ever have those friends that always offer to have you go on vacation with them or whatever, or say, hey, we'll go out to dinner sometime, or we'll have a beer sometime? They're not sincere. They're not real. Or maybe a girl who flirts with you, who, yeah, you know, she's not really going to get with you, but whatever. That's what Putin did. He wasn't serious about it, because right after kind of proposing the idea of Russia joining NATO, which, by the way, many leaders, Clinton included, in the NATO, had basically said, hey, that wasn't a showstopper. But basically, Putin wanted the red carpet rolled out. He didn't want to go through the application process. He didn't want to wait in line, as he put it, and he didn't want to wait in line behind unimportant small nations. Basically, because Russia was big and powerful, no argument there, even then, they wanted to be courted and asked to join, and they wanted the rules to be bent for them. And they were told, well, yeah, you're welcome to apply, but we're not going to give you preferential treatment. Because if they had done that, what would that have said to other nations? Plus, remember when I said other nations had veto power? I wonder, even if by some alternative history Russia did join in 2002 or whatever, would they have used their veto power to basically prevent other nations from joining? Or would they have tried to muscle in and take control of NATO? Of course, we'll never know, because it didn't happen. What did happen is Russia continued to economically improve and expand, and as Putin really started to fill his role as president, Russia established its own alternative defense pact with nations, for example, like Belarus and Kazakhstan, amongst others. So an alternative to NATO was established by Russia, and NATO would continue to get new members. And one such prospective new member was Ukraine. 2006, 2007, they floated the idea of joining NATO. And much like they had told Russia, the idea was, well, you can submit, you can apply. But in 2008, they were basically fobbed off. Going back to the girl analogy, NATO basically told Ukraine that they were busy that night because they were washing their hair. You know, everyone likes to talk about, oh yeah, in 2008, NATO publicly said that Ukraine would join in the future. This is true. However, this wasn't what Ukraine wanted. Ukraine actually wanted to submit their roadmap to join, and that was NATO actually pushing them off gently. They weren't going to say, no, you can never join. That politically is illogical and would not make sense. But they kind of fobbed them off. And so that's when they said, oh yeah, you know, you can join in the future, some undeterminate time. Going back, NATO never said that they wouldn't expand eastward, at least not publicly. No agreement was ever signed. There and again, though, Russia did sign an agreement with Ukraine, offering and insisting they would protect them. And in 1999, Russia agreed to the NATO open door policy, maybe reluctantly. They weren't happy about it. Yeltsin wasn't. Funny thing is, when Putin came in 2001, 2002, he didn't make big waves about these former communist nations joining. It really didn't become an issue until the Baltic states started joining, and former actual Soviet republics. They didn't like this, and you can understand why. However, Russia was doing some things that other nations didn't like either, and was making them nervous. Russia had already had military actions in Chechnya, But in 2008, they started a war with Georgia, a nation that was already expressing interest in joining NATO. By the way, they still aren't a NATO member, but Russia was starting to get kind of aggressive. Now, again, I know that America had Afghanistan and Iraq, and a lot of criticism can be leveled there, but we're into the two wrongs don't make a right, or the whataboutisms. We're not doing that in this video. We're not doing, oh, if the US did it, Russia could. No, that's not how that works. If you try that level of morality, we spiral into anarchy very quickly, because you're not setting a bar higher, you're setting it lower each time. And Russia, probably rightfully, objected to America's intervention in Iraq. Fair enough. But then, of course, they go into Georgia, and that makes them nervous and other nations nervous, which spurs on people wanting to join NATO, the more aggressive Russia gets. But then back to Ukraine, by 2010, there had been some government turnover, and Ukraine themselves publicly said, and after it went to their legislature, that they had no immediate plans, really even no pending plans to join NATO, that they were kind of happy to be in the middle, being friends with everyone, yada, yada, yada. And that's pretty much where it stood until 2014, when there was a government shakeup. The very pro-Russian government in Ukraine was ousted towards the beginning of 2014. Funnily enough, even after this, even after the new government came in, they were not wanting to join NATO. It's on record. They publicly said, we were not joining NATO. It wasn't a thing. Ukraine is a divided nation, at least it was. It's not so much now. It was only after Russia went into Crimea, seized Crimea, that the whole position in Ukraine started to change. And very late August of that year, they changed their position about joining NATO and said that, okay, we're going to maybe renew our application, kind of rethink about this. Because, yeah, Russia's invading us. But eventually this kind of stalled out, and the situation in Crimea, Ukraine was never happy about it. They never accepted that this territory was Russian. But, you know, they've got a foothold. What do you do? And things were stabled. And, of course, then the Zelensky government comes in. And even then, the idea of joining NATO, as we get into 2019, 2020, and then, of course, COVID hits. Even into 2021, though, when Russia starts having rather large, massive troop buildup near or on Ukrainian borders, which, of course, were put off as military exercises, which is the excuse everyone uses. Yeah, they were trying to renew their application for NATO, but it wasn't really going much of anywhere. And then, of course, February 2022, Russia invades. I'm not going to say NATO's innocent in all this, but here's an idea, Russia. When you look back, every time you have an invasion of another country or get militarily aggressive, it gives NATO fuel. When you calm down, entry into NATO kind of subsides. Also, if you want nations to join your own military defense alliance or economic zone, maybe try making it attractive. Maybe offer the carrot, not the stick. Maybe make it, economically, give incentives. Do things. Don't just say, join us because you're supposed to. That's just a crazy thought. And one thing I find particularly galling, because I am very much in favor of democracy. Yeah, it's got a lot of problems, but best we come up with so far. And I'm more in favor of sovereignty. What right, who the fuck do you think you are to tell sovereign nation what they can and can't do. Think about it. Okay, Russia's claim is that they don't want Eastern European nations joining NATO because that gets NATO closer to their border. That's a fair security military concern. However, they have no right to tell Ukraine or Estonia or Romania or Poland or whoever that they can't voluntarily join an alliance. That's the part of being a sovereign nation. If Russia could tell those nations who and what they could join, they're not sovereign. They're not ruling themselves. And Moscow has no claim on those nations. And so we really get to the real reason for the invasion. Russia just wants Ukraine. And this is even starting just to become admitted. Here's their reasoning, and Putin has said this. Ukraine is not a legitimate, valid, independent nation. Ukraine is Russian. It belongs to Russia. Bullshit. Even before the USSR officially completely dissolved in 91, Ukraine had a referendum with a very high voter turnout, with roughly 90% of the population voting to leave the Soviet Union. I shouldn't have to explain why. There was a time in America when not being pro-communist was kind of a given. They were tired of Soviet rule, and they wanted out. Ukraine became its own nation in 1991, 32 years ago. In fact, it wasn't even officially a part of the Soviet Union until the 1930s, although in effect it had been for years before, but officially it wasn't until not long before World War II. Now, what right that a nation left Russia? Russia signed multiple agreements and treaties with, acknowledging that it's a nation. They have just to arbitrarily say, hey, you're not real, you're part of us, come back. It wasn't like there was a civil war, they broke away. It was actually very civil. This is the exact same reasoning that Saddam Hussein had for taking over Kuwait in 1990, which of course led to the Gulf War in 91. He claimed that historically, traditionally, Kuwait was part of Iraq. He's not wrong. If you go back time, Kuwait, at least the region, was part of Iraq, but it was an independent nation. Is this what we're doing? Is this going to be the new norm, that anywhere that was once part of another place, that place can just claim it's back to theirs? Do you see why this might be a problem? It doesn't work. It doesn't hold water. And I don't even think they really view it that way. What Russia does view is that losing Ukraine was culturally traumatic. That Ukraine, even though Moscow would not want to admit it, was much of the birthplace of Russia, or at least proto-Russia. Even before Moscow was much of anything more than a couple of yurts, Ukraine had some pretty advanced civilization and writing. It's obviously been the breadbasket for a long time. Ukraine is part of Russia in a historical, ethnic way. No argument there. And having Ukraine leave, it did psychologically scar Russia. And I actually don't blame the Russian government or the Russian people wanting Ukraine back, because ethnically, they're basically the same people. However, remember that carrot and stick thing? If you want Ukraine back, woo them back. Again, going back to the woman scenario, date her, take her out, offer her things. Ukraine was already kind of 50-50 on which way it wanted to go, west or east. Give them incentives to join Russia in this great future. Instead, what did Putin do? He raped her. He raped Ukraine. And unfortunately for him, she definitely fought back more than they ever could have imagined. Russia essentially got away with taking Crimea. Ukraine fought and did continue to fight. That's actually where the Azov Battalion really kind of made a name for themselves. And the international community protested and sanctioned. But after a little time, life kind of resumed normal. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a good example of that. Relations with Germany were good, or at least decent. And I'm sorry, but if you look historically back, America has actually been very cordial to Russia. I'm sorry, but what has America really done? I mean, okay, again, there's been political disagreements here and there. That happens with every nation. America and Britain has them too. But America really bent over backwards, especially in recent years, to accommodate Russia. And what did Russia do? It started painting the West, i.e. America, but the West in general, is this great amorphous enemy. We're talking inside Russia with Russian media, Russian propaganda. And so that was kind of the deal. Okay, we're going in, and it's been said, and it's correct. I think if Russia had kind of just limited themselves to taking more of the Donbass region, especially the Russian areas, the Russian-speaking, the ethnic Russian areas, they probably could have got away with doing what they had done in 2014 and 2022, taking a little more. But for whatever reason, they tried to take Kiev. They tried to take the whole country. And that was too much. It realistically would have never worked. Could never work. Russia is a nation of roughly 150 million people. Ukraine is 45 million. You cannot control a population essentially a third your size unless they want to be under your control. Russia tried for a decade to control Afghanistan, which only has a population of a couple of million. It didn't work. America tried the same with Vietnam. It didn't work, and America has twice the population of Russia. If a people don't want to be ruled en masse, it's not going to happen. Now, to America's credit, when we went into Iraq, we generally speaking behaved ourselves. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that there were atrocities, I know that there were issues, Blackwater things, all that. But by and large, military targets were targeted and civilian targets were not. Not getting into America's thing, because it doesn't matter what America did. This is about Russia. We're not doing whataboutisms. We're not trying to use other people's sins to justify Russia's. But what did Russia do when it went into Ukraine? First, it did not restrict itself to civilian or military targets. It just indiscriminate. And then, of course, after a month or two, the atrocities came out, rapes and thefts and murders and other just rather horrible things. It's funny, Russia's provocation for going in, one of them anyway, was the genocide of Russians in the Donbass region. Yet, they have killed thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even more during their time there. And this is why the opinion of Russia has dramatically shifted. Again, it was basically 50-50 before, with Donbass being pretty much pro-Russian. It ain't now. And, thousands of those people they killed were probably once pro-Russian. Kind of reminds me of when the Nazis, the German Nazis rather, came into some parts of Eastern Europe. At first, some places welcomed them as liberators. They weren't happy with their current government. It was either corrupt or communist or both. And from World War I, people didn't remember the Germans as being bad. Maybe not good, but, they were considered ethical. But it was only after they came in that people realized, hey, these aren't our friends. In fact, one of those nations was Ukraine. Many people in Ukraine welcomed the Germans because they hated being communists so much. And how did the Germans repay them? They slaughtered them. They killed them. They didn't invite allies. And this is what modern day Putin's Russia is doing there too. Foolish. This is why we actually see Russians fighting against Russians in Ukraine, even in Russia now. And we'll get to what's going on inside of Russia too, because this is no longer really Ukrainian war. But yeah, Russia did more damage, including some nuclear accidents. Luckily, nothing on the scale of Chernobyl, which, remember, is in Ukraine. But there's been some, all their talk about nuclear weapons and biological, they've risked that more than anything before. So they're not whole water. Their reasons is that they wanted to take back Ukraine. In particular, wanted a legacy. He wanted to reestablish the Russian Empire. And therein, it would not have stopped with Ukraine if, for whatever reason, Ukraine was subdued and became part of Russia again. It would be someone next. Putin's ambitions would not end there because he had no reason for going into Ukraine that was legitimate, except to add to his place in history and add to Russian territory. It's bad. It's real bad. So again, even if Russia had legitimate grievances against NATO, taking them out on Ukraine, who was not about to join NATO in the first place, is completely irrational. If you wanted Ukraine on Russia's side, like I said, there were pretty much every other way would have been better than what we ended up with. That was not the way to win hearts and minds. And it's also actually been a boon to NATO. In the past, when the Georgian War started, that benefited NATO. Operations before, in 99 through Russia, did too. And we're seeing another increase in NATO. Historically, just last month, Finland became a member of NATO, something that up until recently would have been difficult to imagine. Obviously, the idea of Finland joining NATO had been floated around, but they were kind of happy to be neutral after the 1940s events and everything. They assured their position by towing the line between Russia and the West. But you know how I said that it wouldn't stop with Ukraine? Well, guess who also used to be Russian territory? Yeah, Finland. They left in 1917 because they were vehemently anti-communist. If Putin took Ukraine, Finland could have very well been next. So public support, which had been kind of lukewarm at best, jumped way up in Finland. So it passed their government. They put in their application with NATO. And actually, one of the bigger holdouts for a little while was Turkey, but they finally came around in early 2023. There were some negotiations. Again, everyone has veto power. And April 4, they became a member. Right behind them, Sweden. And you can understand Finland went. Sweden has also kind of towed the line, being more or less neutral, although more closely aligned with the West because we are going further west. But for example, Sweden sent troops during the Winter War and continuation wars. Now, Sweden's application, while it easily passed their government, their people, it's still being held up in NATO. Again, Turkey, they've got some political disagreements over the Turkish government and various political parties. Neither here nor there. I believe, especially if the situation continues, that we'll see Sweden joining. Of course, Ukraine. After everything going on, they formally asked to join not only NATO, but the EU. And I think it's September of 2022. At this time, their application is still very much up in the air because, oh boy, they're currently in a war. They're currently invaded. They have foreign soldiers on their soil. If they were to join NATO, if NATO let them in as it is, Article 5 would be invoked, and you would see bad things. Oh boy. So I can understand there. That's a rock and a hard place. It really is. But through Russia's actions, NATO has one new member, the first one in several years, and potentially could have more. For example, Bosnia is also waiting in the wings. Georgia is still waiting in the wings. We could see 4, even 5 new members joining NATO that probably would not have joined except for Russia is looking terrifying. Just imagine. Putin is unpredictable. Your nation could be next. Putin has done for NATO better than anything. I mean, a few years ago, NATO was considered a dinosaur, obsolete. Trump was even talking about pulling out of NATO. You know, there were calls for, should the U.S. really be funding it? Those are gone. America's commitment to NATO has been reaffirmed. And it's not because of Biden. Not all, anyway. I think even if Trump were a member, were president, it would still be one of those things that would be hard to question. So Putin has helped NATO out a lot. And not Russia. Before this war, the Russian military looked pretty good. You know, on this channel, I looked at several of their new aircraft, their new updated tanks. Yeah, on paper, they were modernizing. They were large. You know, all these reality shows showed Spetsnaz soldiers doing their thing. Maybe a little crude, but very effective. This has really exposed the rotten underbelly. All this defense spending in Russia, most of it was embezzled, frankly. You know, if they thought they had 100 of the new jet, they might have 10. If they thought they'd updated 500 tanks, it turns out only 50 had been. And other tanks had fake armor. That was a big story. You know, they went them out. They, instead of having modern reactive armor, they had concrete. It really exposed that the military was only strong on paper. And of course, this is why we see them trotting out 80s era, even 70s era technology. T-72s, even some T-64s. This is also why Russia has reached out to North Korea to get ordnance, to get weapons. To be fair, America reached out to West Germany when the Vietnam War started, but a little bit different, I'd say. This is because Putin has obtained absolute power. And I would argue this situation is worse than Soviet times, arguably even worse than Stalinist times. Okay, Stalin had pretty much absolute control. But Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, they had the Politburo. They had other people in the party that kind of kept them in check. Even Stalin had some basic checks. Not many, but some. Putin came in 2000, like I said. He was supposed to be out in 2008. That was the end of his term. Well, terms per the Constitution. He did a little bit of trickery and became prime minister. Gray. Not expressly forbidden by the Constitution, but kind of going against the spirit. But when he ripped the Russian Constitution up and used it as toilet paper, it was 2012 when he regained the presidency. This is when he essentially became dictator with unlimited power. And all these years, he's been slowly but surely dismantling the Russian government, checks and balances. After he did that, he dismantled the Russian media, independent news. There's jokes to be made about America, but trust me, you might think it's bad here. I would agree with you, it's not good, but it's worse in Russia and has been for a number of years. I'm bringing this up because there was no oversight. Whoever got the military contract was either who Putin said did or one of Putin's buddies said did. And funnily enough, most of the people that got military contracts were connected to or were directly Putin's buddies. Now, there were the oligarchs at one time, not a good group of people, but even they were subordinate to Putin. To his credit, he was very intelligent about defanging them. He pitted them against each other to earn his favor. Therefore, they never could make a effective coalition to not overthrow him, but just kind of balance out his power. But without oversight, without any accountability, no one knew that all these rubles being dumped into new fighter jets or weapons or artillery or even training of the soldiers was going where it needed to go. And as it turns out, surprise, it wasn't. And the Russian military has a long history of less than things. Look at the... I love that film. But, when you look at the late 90s, or a former Soviet being sold out the back. And, yeah. So it's exposed Russia, whose military wasn't really kept a lot of people. It exposed it as a paper tiger. And this is why, as a last resort, has done something that really no other has felt the need to do in decades. Brandish his red rocket, his new, reminding the world that will use them. We don't need to hear that. And that's not, when you say that, that's not power. Everyone knows Russia has nuclear weapons. Saying it actually makes it less viable. If your jets and tanks aren't kept up to date, I'm not convinced your ICBMs are. Those things are hard to maintain. You have to change out the computers because of the radiation. You have to, refuel regularly. There's a lot of maintenance in ICBMs. And there's also a lot of maintenance with submarines. Look at the Kursk disaster back in 2000. I've heard horror stories about the status of the Russian Navy going back to when I was in school. On paper, it's better, but now, is it? I definitely don't trust their Air Force. They're having part shortages for even transport aircraft, much less nuclear bombers. I don't know. I don't know that they could really do it. It's almost like, would they need to be rattling that nuclear saber if they actually had an effective nuclear system? And this goes back to the days of Eisenhower and Kennedy. Russia, as we know historically, bluffed about their nuclear a lot. And that's okay. Nuclear weapons are a deterrent. But they were a deterrent for, hey, don't invade Russian soil. Not, hey, leave us alone while we invade this sovereign nation and kill thousands of women and children and rape more and do this and that. That's a weak position. You didn't hear America threatening nuclear weapons when we were in Vietnam. And again, not saying that was a good war. Is there ever such a thing? But, yeah, position. Inside Russia, things are getting really bad, especially this year too. It's not reported on American news because we're too busy wrapped up in our bullshit, frankly. I am sick to death of American news. It's gotten ridiculous and self-absorbed. Real things are happening in Russia. Now, you're not going to hear it on Russian news. Remember, RT, Russia Today, is Putin propaganda. At this point, Russian media is no more trustworthy than North Korean state media. Please keep that in mind. The Russians have been masters of propaganda for a very long time, guys. And Putin was KGB, today FSB. You cannot trust what he says. This was something we knew as Americans about the Soviets in the 60s and 70s, but somehow we've forgotten it. Communist was just a name. It was actually authoritarianism. And Putin, with a new coat of paint, is carrying on that authoritarianism. Very, very little difference between what was happening in the 70s and 80s and today. Well, there is, because there wasn't this level of corruption. A corrupt version of the system, if you will. But inside Russia, for months now, there have been, frankly, domestic terrorist attacks, or freedom fighters, whatever you want to call it. We're talking bombings of rail cars. We're talking lighting ammunition plants on fire. There was that famous, drone thing over Moscow a few weeks ago. There's been a lot of resistance, from just, soaping a police officer's car to full-scale insurrection in some areas. In fact, there are plenty of Russians in exile fighting on the Ukrainian side against Russians, and there's even been attacks on Russian soil. So war in Ukraine is starting to spill over into Russia. And you're having breakdown of civil services, including sewage in a few areas like Voronezh. That was a few months back. It's bad. And it continues to get worse. The condition in training camps, conscription is at an all-time high. No male is safe. Sometimes we'll just go on the streets and round up men and say, you're in the army now. Essentially, rule of law is gone. The trials, due process, that's all suspended. Whoever goes to jail, just whoever Putin or his people say goes to jail. It could be over the most ridiculous things. I don't want to get into that now. This is a long enough video already. But you have literal children getting in trouble. You have old people getting in trouble. It's whoever. There's no dissent allowed. And that's something even the Soviets didn't do. The Soviets, as tight as they were in the 60s, they allowed some underground dissidents. Nothing major, nothing bad to their eyes. But, a little bit of music, a little bit of underground graffiti. It was a pressure valve, a steam valve, to kind of keep the lid on things. Even in the 1930s, during the worst of the Stalin era, pretty much if you went to work, kept your head down, didn't stand out, you weren't going to get black bagged at night. They really did black bag people, guys. And they really did shoot people in basements. But unless you were, I don't want to say, there were innocents. I don't want to downplay that. But you could kind of keep your head down and just stay out of it. You can't do that with Putin. Anyone can fall victim for the smallest thing they might have posted online, that they might have said, that they might have drawn. Who knows? A slip of the tongue, saying the word war at the wrong place and time. It's very, very bad. And when you get picked up for any of these quote-unquote crimes, you don't get a slap on the wrist like you do in America. You go to Russian jail, which is a little worse than American jail, to say the least, for 20, 25 years. And this is why we're seeing this level of domestic terrorism, or, patriotism, if you prefer. Kind of depends on who wins, really. If you're going to go to jail for 20 years for, say, writing the word war on the side of a building, or if you're going to go to jail for 20 years for, lighting a pipe bomb on a rail car, hey, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? By taking that degree away, it's inspired people just to go for nothing. And at this point, 15 months into the war, most everyone's lost someone to this war. Or they have a Ukrainian family member. Even in Russia, even despite the media, news is starting to trickle out. Because this isn't the 1950s, where if you control the radio, if you control the TV, you control everything. And Putin does. He controls the radio and TV in Russia, no doubt. you can't control the internet aside from just shutting it off, which they haven't done yet. Although if you're in Russia, you better damn well use a VPN. This would be a really interesting place to put in a plug if I was sponsored, but I'm not. But truly, you have to. And of course, flights in and out of Russia are severely curtailed. And connection to the West, this demon that Russia, really Putin made, is gone. That's bad, because as much as Putin wants to disparage the West, they need the West for parts, for airplanes, for computers, for capital, for trade. I mean, Visa card and all that shut down a long time ago now in Russia. And of course, now we come to the one winner in all of this. Although I don't think they inspired it, I think they're just taking advantage of the situation. China. Of all people, Putin is turning to China, to Xi for this. That is fucking stupid. I'm sorry, but yeah, we had the Cold War. America versus Russia, East versus West. But America hasn't really gone to war with Russia outside of, 1919, post-World War I, the whole Reds and Whites thing. Let's put that aside. But in the 20s and 30s, America essentially sold at very good prices, grain to Russia when it needed it. We were allies in World War II. And the 50s were rocky, but even though it was a terrifying time, I think it was a mutually respectful, terrifying time. And then in the 60s and 70s, the space race. A lot of mutual respect there, culminating in Apollo-Soyuz in 1975. Daytona. Now, it heated up in the 80s again, but that cooled off quite quickly. And while we had our differences in the 90s and 2000s, we more or less got along. Not so with Russia and China. There have historically been border skirmishes, and relations between Stalin and Mao were not good. And while there was a tiny thaw in the early 60s between Khrushchev, that didn't last long, and that's actually how Nixon was able to open up the door between the U.S. and China and kind of leave Russia in the cold. Just because Russia and China were nominally both communist doesn't mean they were friends. Far, far from it. And China, they're very clever. And that's who Putin's turning to. And it's really stupid. China is getting all kinds of concessions. They're buying oil, gas, 10 cents on the dollar, even less. Yeah, they're giving Russia business, but they're profiting majorly. They're also getting lots of military technology. Going back, there was a big deal about the Sukhoi, the engines, China's WS-10 engine. They had a lot of trouble making a good jet engine, and they copied Russia, and Russia wasn't happy about this, yada, yada. Now they're just getting military tech from Russia, willy-nilly. They're getting everything they want, including access to Russian markets and a foothold in eastern Russia. They're not your friend. They're taking advantage of a situation. At the same time, they are a good counterbalance. You notice whenever Putin gets a little too nuclear talky-talky, China kind of backs off, then he shuts up a bit, then China comes back, because China doesn't want a nuclear war. China might want to rule the world economically. They don't want it to be a nuclear wasteland. They played Fallout. It sucks. But it is horrible that Russia is basically Putin is rather selling Russia to China, putting Russia effectively in China's pocket as a vassal state. Yes, we can argue that China's got their hooks in America. No, they do. Nothing like what's happening over there. Not to mention the huge land border between the two nations. And you know how I said that Russia used that excuse for raiding Ukraine about, Nazis there and all this and that? With that excuse in mind, why couldn't China use the same excuse to take over Russian oil fields in the east? There's ethnic Chinese or Asians living in Russia that are more Chinese than Slavic. They can claim this area was once part of China or the Chinese province, or they could just claim that there are Nazis or whatever and come in to seize. That's what's dangerous about those whole reasons for war. Other people can use them too. I'm not saying it's likely to happen. China's not much for the military expansion outside of maybe Taiwan, but a weakened Russia serves China immensely. Before all this, we kind of had a three-power system. America, the old superpower, China, the rising superpower, and Russia, the recovering superpower. We don't have that anymore. Russia's no longer a superpower. And it's not good for Russia that they're being subsumed by China, and it's sure as hell not good for us. This is benefiting China, but they realize they are playing with fire because they can't have it go too far. I just want to point that out. The historical situation with Russia and China isn't good. Putin might want to play the West off as its enemy, but that's because we're a good target. We're half a world away. We're an ocean away. China isn't. Letting China be your friend in those ways is not going to end well for any of us if this continues. And how does this continue? I do not know. This is old world imperialism. This is might makes right. And this is dangerous. And we're all kind of in a no-win situation. Most of all, Russia. This isn't benefiting Russia. Economically, they've lost. Internationally, they've lost. This isn't even benefiting Putin. Before all this, he was pretty unequivocally the most wealthy man in the world because Russia was essentially, he owned it. He has lost. And if you look at him today, his health isn't good. Who's to say how much of it is this and how much of it's other things? He's in fear of his life, afraid to make public appearances. You want to joke about Biden staying in a basement during COVID? Putin was 10 times worse. He was in a lockdown bunker making fake videos about being on Aeroflot. They weren't true. Those were not services. He is hidden out underground. And I think that's part of the problem. Putin isn't an internet person. He relies on old-fashioned, he's a boomer. Let's just cut to the bullshit. He's a boomer that never adopted internet. And in the beginning, 2000, 2001, he had advisors that told him the truth or gave him good info. He engaged with world leaders because Russia was very much still recovering. Huge economic downturn back in 98. But he's removed all the naysayers, all the counterpoints, especially since 2012. We often say on the internet echo chamber and bubble. And a lot of times it's not really justified. But Putin really is. All he hears are from people that are his literal yes men. And all Russian media, we joke about Trump watching Fox, but he didn't own Fox. But Putin owns RT, or might as well do. Anything that presented an alternative opinion, he didn't look at. And he didn't engage on the internet. At least Trump used Twitter. Putin does not, and never has. I think it was a true miscalculation. I don't think he realized his actual military status. I don't think he realized the actual status of the world. I don't think he realized Ukraine's position. I think he just thought that he could come in and take Ukraine, much like he had taken Crimea, that Zelensky's government would just fall immediately. And none of that happened. And I think he thought that NATO was weak and ineffective, which, to be fair, wasn't looking great, but resolve came more than he thought. He just over and underestimated things that he really, really should not have. And here's the problem. This isn't a video game. This isn't civilization or Risk. This is real life. And I want to kind of end by giving some real stories to add the human element. Because so far we're just talking numbers and this and that and sweeping political things. And you can argue this and that. But I think you're good people, and maybe we can kind of really reach out on this human suffering level, because that is happening for millions of people in 2, even more nations. Let me talk about Ukraine. Politically, there's been ups and downs, changes in governments, a corrupt government here or there, no arguments there. But it was a modern nation. iPhones, internet, everything we know and love, music. It's not that anymore. People like you and me, people living in cities, people working on farms, and it was a big farming area, have had missiles and bombs hitting their homes, their hospitals, killing their children, their elderly, leaving dogs and cats, strays, orphans, or dead, of course. These are people like us who, despite NATO, which isn't even part of Ukraine, I love when people try to justify what Russia's doing because of this and that NATO. Fine, blame NATO, but they're not Ukraine. Why are you attacking Ukraine? Or Zelensky. Okay, fine, the government, this or that. There are things that Zelensky did do that I didn't care for either. But you know what? There's things that American government has done. Should Britain or Europe come over here and invade us because they don't like what Biden or, yes, even Trump did? Of course not. We're a sovereign nation. That's our internal thing. But even if Zelensky were bad, why target the people? And I know you know this, but I want to bring it home. These people who saved money, who for most of them, at least military age, Ukraine was always Ukraine, its own nation. Again, 32 years ago, it became independent. They've lost it all their life savings. They've lost loved ones, or they've been maimed, they've been crippled, or they're holding a gun in a trench, eating stinking food, shitting in a bucket. When, a year ago they were working in an office. What the fuck? This is real. These are people like us suffering for over a year for absolutely nothing they did wrong. These aren't Nazis. That's propaganda. They weren't. These aren't people that were threatening Russia in any meaningful way. They're just decent human beings. Ukrainians are great people. They're passionate. They're emotional. They're fun. They love to drink and get fun. They're also great lovers. Don't ask me how I know. My wife doesn't watch these videos anyway. They're like us. They're modern. Whether they went with Russia or the West, it's immaterial. That's a cultural thing. We joke about a culture war in America. These are real people. Don't just wash your hands of this. Don't ignore this level of suffering, please. That's what makes it wrong. And what makes it even worse is it's on both sides. Because it's no better for Russians. The Russians fighting in Ukraine now, by and large. Now, there are those private military contractors, and those are the ones really doing the worst atrocities. Ironically, Before all this, according to the Russian Constitution, private military contractors were illegal in a war. But of course, Putin does whatever the hell he wants. But the Russians being conscripted, these are just kids or college students or workers who literally received a letter in the mail or were just walking down the street and were grabbed. They were sent to inadequate camps without any real training, given a rifle that was maybe made in the 60s or 70s or 80s, and sent to fight a war even more pointless than Vietnam, if that's possible. And they're hungry. They don't have enough rations, or sometimes they were given expired rations. A lot of casualties from friendly fire because of inadequate training or drunkenness. That's happening a lot now too. They don't want to be there. They shouldn't be there. They're fighting their brothers, Ukraine and Russia. It's ridiculous. So even the Russian soldiers, while they are the invaders, while they are the bad guys, are victims in and of themselves. And of course at home, you had a nation, you had a population that was becoming very economically prosperous over the last 20 years. They had savings in bank accounts. They had international ties. Maybe they even worked for international companies. Their life savings were wiped out. They didn't know if they could even go to the store and get all the provisions they needed. They lived in terror of their brother or son or father dying in this pointless war. And all for the hubris of a, frankly, madman at the top of a nation that has lost all perspective, all grip on reality. We think Trump or Biden have kind of aged out. Even though Putin's younger, he's certainly showing more signs of it than either of them seem to be. Kind of puts it into perspective, American politics, doesn't it? And now I'm going to tell a personal story. Why not? Drive it home. As some know, my wife is Russian. And believe it or not, we didn't meet on one of those websites. In fact, we didn't meet planning to get married at all. We met by total chance, randomness, at a New Year's thing, because I was going over to Russia to be a teacher. And our relationship doesn't matter. Suffice it to say, we've been together a long time now. And the only reason we live in America, it was because of the breakdown of relations between Russia and America. Yeah, it didn't just start with Biden, believe it or not, or Obama. Actually, up until 2004, an American could go over to Russia without a visa. Then, because of the very first signs of deterioration post the Iraq War, they started implementing the visa program. In 2008, it got worse. This is under the Bush administration, of course. And essentially, I lost my job and visa and had to come home at the end of that year. And my wife had to come here. It wasn't something either of us had really planned for. So she left her family behind. And for years, she was able to go visit them every year, year and a half, couple of weeks. I used to do videos when she was gone, just relaxing a bit, seeing old friends. The last time she was able to go was 2019, in October. Obviously, she was not able to go in 2020 because of COVID. I want to make a quick aside. Those of you that think America and COVID was bad and mishandled and the government was authoritarian, what America did or didn't do has nothing on what Putin did. We talk here about how it was illegal not to get the vaccine and all that. It was literally illegal over there not to get the vaccine. Like, if you didn't do it, you went to jail, for real. Not like, oh, fake poo-poo. No. Putin was incredibly authoritarian about that. Much more so than Trump or Biden would have ever been. Just wanted to point that out. So don't think that Putin's some bastion of freedom on that level. Quite the opposite. Because again, he's communism just with a new coat of paint. You do what the state says. Anyway, 2022, all that's over. We're hoping for travel to resume. And then all this starts. Not only could she not fly home to see her family, we couldn't even send money or even buy things. We used to buy things and, send them over there. Couldn't do that. Couldn't send gifts, birthday gifts, Christmas gifts. And that's persisted until this year. At which time, we found out that her father has brain cancer and went through emergency surgery. He got bumped kind of the top of the list because he's retired military. Specifically, he was a doctor. And I don't have a problem with that. I think that's fair because he saved hundreds, thousands of lives during his career. This is just kind of payback. He did survive the surgery, but it's terminal. Be it weeks or months, he does not have much time left. My wife very likely will not get to see her father before he dies because of this fucking war in Putin. I know that's small compared to the loss that many in Ukraine have faced, or even many in Russia. I know. But it's personal. It matters. And it is hurtful because in 2021, I was not able to see my father right before he died because of COVID restrictions in the hospital. Many whinge on about masks and all this, whatever. How many of you missed the end of a loved one because of COVID? I know some of you did. Whether you say it was real or not, it doesn't matter. But the fact is, I could not get in there to see him. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not being able to say goodbye. It's something 2 years later I still deal with. Why does it haunt me? I don't know, but it does. Not being able to have that closure matters. It does, somehow. And seeing that my wife, someone I love desperately, might have to go through the same thing fills me with fucking outrage. That's a real story. This is how it's affecting real people. There are so many more people that can't see their children or parents or even spouses because of this war. This war to satisfy a crazy man's hubris. This war that's cost the lives or livelihood of thousands, maybe even millions. This war that's destabilized the entire world. This war that has exposed the weakness of Russia and led to further improvement in China's position and thus a larger threat to America. Don't blather on to me about NATO and all this and that. That's pointless. That's excuses. That's meaningless at this point. There's a level of response. If that girl, even if she flirted with you, turns you down, you don't punch her in the face and you don't rape her. You don't do that. That's what Putin's done. Russia had some grievances that should have been heard, but those were matters for negotiation, not unlimited warfare. And not unlimited warfare that's gone on so long. This has sucked Russia dry. This is all their money. This is all their resources gone for nothing. Do you see how pointless this is? And that's why I said at the beginning, this is wrong. This is a disaster. Sure, for Ukraine, obviously. For Russia. For America. For Europe. even maybe for China in the long run. Because what happens? There's no exit strategy. There's no way out now. If Putin dies, he has no successor. Who gains control of Russia? Will it break apart? Will it devolve into civil war? I don't know. If Putin continues for 10 years more, what happens? No one can seriously sit across the negotiating table with him now, knowing what he's done, knowing the blood on his hands. Be real. If someone did this to the US, Canada, even though our nations are far from blameless, even though our politics are messy, they would have no right, and we know that. Russia had no right for this war, and everyone who dies at this point is a victim, and lives are destroyed. So it does frustrate me when I see people talking about they're on this side or that or blah, 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 or the billions that America is sending to Ukraine or not, and the money going away. Those are things to talk about, sure. But they just don't matter. And it does break my heart. And this is something that should not have happened, that we should have grown out of as a species. So please, don't, I don't know, don't promote this, don't look away, understand the suffering, understand that this has gone on too long, too far. Acknowledge what people have lost, acknowledge the meaning of their lives, please. Be a human. Don't get caught up in internet drama. Don't get caught up in kind of the this and that, the politics of it. Once in a while, there's just something that's just morally right and morally wrong. And this is one of those things. It really is. For those who've stayed here this long, I wanted to do a video because we are pretty much at an anniversary point of this. It's gone on so long. And I promise you, when it's over, when the news comes out, when people go in, when Ukraine has to be rebuilt, the full scale, the full tragedy will be unveiled, and it will be worse than we imagined. And then in Russia, what's going to happen? I don't know, but it's worrisome. It really is. Anyway, guys, haven't really done a serious Blackbox in a while. I think this qualifies as serious enough, don't you? Again, feel free to comment. Just please be respectful, not of me, but of the humans, Russians and Ukrainians, both, that have lost so much. Just try to imagine, try to give empathy. Imagine you're in their shoes. That's all I really ask. With that, this is Misha, and I think next time I'll definitely have to do a fun video to kind of lift up from this. What do you think? I still want to talk about sovereign citizens. I think that'd be a fun one. We could always revisit flat earthers. You know, other weird things. A little less serious because people aren't, you know, hurting on that level. Anyway, hope everyone is doing well. All the best wishes. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.